So this is the bag, the mkoba wa okili, that I'm talking about today, and more specifically talking about the compelling description of its contents by Leslie Matola. You might not be able to see this on the screen, the quotes intelligent native of the museum label there. Yep. Okay, that's how it works. And the bag was part of a bequest made to the Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology in Cambridge in 1926 by the classicist and archaeologist professor, as he became, Professor Sir William Ridgeway, who you can see there, who had amassed objects of interest from around the world. And the bag and its contents were purchased in 1911 from an unnamed mganga, traditional practitioner, indigenous practitioner, if you like, in the village of Tumbe, aspirated Tumbe, I think, in the north of Pemba Island. And the collector was Leslie Matola. I'm afraid I don't have a picture of him. I don't know a lot about him, but I'll tell you a little I know. He was a mission teacher who had been working there for a decade. So since the early 1900s, start of the century, if you like. And he sent the bag and other items he'd purchased for Ridgeway via the Reverend Egbert Hudson in Zanzibar, who acted on behalf of the professor. I don't think he actually used a horse, but that's one of the only picture I could find of Hudson in haste. So when the bag was bequeathed to the museum 15 years later, it was accompanied by a small bundle of correspondence, and correspondence relating to the collection, mostly letters and notes written by Matola, including a 49-page description and discussion of the bag's contents, written and sent in 2 installments. So that long description was sent in two installments. I don't know if you can read some of that text. Yes, I think you can. And the first letter, dated the 11th of July 1911, listed the contents of the bag, a total of 22 different objects and bundles of objects. And one of these, number 13, on the right there, which is N in the museum's relabeling, has gone missing. That's the Kigwecha Yasin, who's no longer there, though its label and Matola's description survive. Now, almost half of the items listed are pieces of wood and roots from plants. There's relatively little material from animals. There's a bit, but not as much as has been described, say, from the bags of Waganga on the mainland. And the items and account that Matola elicited from the mganga, who was apparently still practicing, you can deduce that from some of the things that Matola says, suggests that the mganga offered a wide range of services, from the provision of charms and filters to circumcision, and the performance of spirit possession rituals. I mean, basically, he did a whole load of stuff if this was representative of his work. And I'm currently in the process of developing a detailed commentary on all of this, which I'll leave for the museum in Cambridge, along with plant identifications, linguistic notes, and so on. There's so much detail that I can't mention today. And a particular note, a number of items with morbid associations, consistent with narratives of Uganga and Uchawi on Pemba that persist to this day. And so we have pieces of burial board, viunza, a bottle of alleged human blood mixed in with other unidentified material, a bottle of the notorious, the infamous Uganga Wandere, which literally means the powder of death or powder of the dead. Incidentally, it took me a while to realize this, but and dairy. The word dairy is a derivative. It's an old perfective of the verb kulala. So it's from lele, turned into a sort of nominal form in class 9. So it literally means the sort of powder of death, or the dead, or the died, or whatever phrase you prefer. And there's another bottle of oil, usually sold, or usually said, or said to be obtained from human fat, oil from human fat. Now, Matola's description of all of these items and their stated uses is wonderfully detailed. Here, for example, is part of his account. You can read some of his handwriting. It's part of his account of how unga wanderi is said to be obtained from the maggots that drop from a suspended corpse, and the last surviving, and so fattest maggot that has devoured the others. And I'm sorry that I'm doing this present. Perhaps I shouldn't have been scheduled just before lunch, but there are many other descriptions. There are other descriptions and accounts of how unga wanderi was processed from these suspended corpses. Sometimes the bones are involved as well, round bones. Now, let me say something at this point about Matola's background. He was one of a number of gifted children of a well-known Yao chief from Newala, and early mission supporter who's known in the literature as Matola I. And Leslie was born around 1882, and along with some of his brothers, studied at the UMCA. UMCA is the University's Mission for Central Africa, the UMC College at Kiungani in Zanzibar, which produced a lot of very well-trained and gifted teachers. And he was trained there before being sent to work as a mission teacher and plantation supervisor in Pemba. This is the era after slaves have been freed, of course. And it's clear from his publications and the praise heaped on him by the British missionaries, that as well as imbibing the mission's teaching, he had an inquiring mind and an enthusiasm for engaging with his Muslim hosts, despite their differences. And this seems to be something that he carried on throughout his life, even after he was on Pemba. He was, there are reports of him being engaged in these sort of multi-faith conversations. And so, as well as relaying the information given to him by the bag's original owner, he reflected on its wider significance, on the origin of an analogical reasoning underlying African medicines and specific items in the bag. Moreover, he invited Professor Ridgeway, indirectly perhaps, he invited Professor Ridgeway to consider the truth of the black and white stories, as he called them, that had been told, suggesting that a number of items should be tested to ascertain their actual composition. Now, Matola's skepticism was prompted at points by the mganga's apparent admission that some of his nefarious substances were actually of a more benign nature. The infamous the infamous unga wanderi was really a ground tuber, and catfish oil was masquerading as its human equivalent. So the oil from human fat was apparently really from a catfish. Or was the mganga bluffing and hiding the horrible truth of the origin of these things? The only way to be certain was for the professor to have them tested. And at the same time, Matola had not completely abandoned what might be called traditional belief, as can be seen here from his thoughts on the fishy bottle of oil. But his insistence on and confidence in the value of testing remains the most striking feature of his approach, and it sets him apart from many other missionaries and followers, mission staff and followers writing at the time, and seems to reflect a genuine curiosity stemming from his experience of two very different worlds of thought, or at least two very different modes of thought. Work by the missionaries, I doubt that any attempt was made to follow up on his suggestions. In some ways, he was thinking ahead of his time, and only more recently would testing of the kind he envisaged be possible. The Mganga's Baga and Matola's letters remained neglected for nearly a century and played no role in understandings of witchcraft as they evolved, or perhaps in some cases didn't evolve, under on Pemba under missionary influence. And on the left of that slide is some of the different iterations of the missionary Eleanor Voole's work on witchcraft. There are actually 3 different versions of this publication on African witchcraft. Different versions of that were published. And of course, on the right is Natalie's work, which sets this in context and which I'm going to relate this further to. And as Natalie shows in the early part of her book, this was a time, 1910-11 was a time of intensive debate among the administration as well in Zanzibar about witchcraft, because they were debating whether to import a witchcraft ordinance from the mainland and whether it's appropriate to do so. So there's a lot of writing by administrators and others about witchcraft and what witchcraft was and how important it was at this time. Although in many ways, what Matola did was sort of not really a part of that and had its own independent origin. And, you know, obviously you got a request, you know, could you just collect some stuff for this professor in Cambridge? And it wasn't limited to this kind of item at all. He collected all sorts of other cultural objects. Now, Matola himself didn't stay still. He later joined his brothers in Dar and rose from being a teacher to chief interpreter at the High Court of Tanganyika. At least I think so. He wrote for at least 1 newspaper, and he argued for the standardization of Swahili. Pops up with one of his brothers in this meeting in 1925, arguing for the standardization of Swahili along with others. And he became an early member of the African Association, which was a forerunner of TANU, the Tanganyika African National Union. And his brother Cecil Matola is actually more well known because he was a founder of the African Association and on some accounts its first president. After retirement, Leslie became one of the founders of the Bahá'í congregation in Dar. So he left his Christianity and translated himself into the Bahá'í Faith. He was one of the founding members of that community and its first assembly in Dar es Salaam in 1952. And when he died, ironically, his burial in the Bahá'í plot in the European cemetery was at first contested by the colonial authorities, as he was followed into death by black and white stories of another kind. The colonial authorities did eventually agree to his burial there, but at first they objected because of his race. And that's the little that I know about Matola, abstracted from what I can find online. So I've yet to sort of try and delve into the archives, and I'm sure the full story of his life, which looks to me as though it really deserves to be told, will be found partly in the archives in Dar, which I'm not sure, but I'll get to anytime soon, if at all. But if anybody here knows the Matola family or members of that family, or has any information that they might think be relevant, then please do tell me before the end of the day or later by email. And if anybody wants to pick up on that topic of researching life, then you know, I'd be very happy for that to happen, because it would help round out this interesting collection and help us understand more what its kind of place was in both Zanzibar history and the history of Tanzania as a nation. Thank you very much.